Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'du fa'auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Take a moment to ponder over this picture and imagine what it'd be like to be stuck in a place like this. Cold, wet, damp. And then think how you'd be feeling, knowing potentially that beyond this situation, that you are to be sent to your execution. Terrified comes to mind, fearful comes to mind. This was the plight of Sahibzada Abdul Latif radhiyallahu anhu. So as an introduction about Sahibzada Sahib, I'd like to first mention what his prominence was in the land of Afghanistan. He was very, very well known. In today's world, one would say he'd be like a celebrity. Everyone across the whole nation knew who he was. He owned approximately 30,000 acres of land, and he had approximately 50,000 plus followers, disciples, people that took learned information from him. He traveled a lot to gain knowledge. In fact, he stayed in Amritsar for up to 3 years to gain and learn more information in terms of Islam and with the Quran. Beyond this, he was a very trusted noble of the king of the time, King Habibullah. So you can imagine his prominence. He's not just an average person. This person holds a lot of prominence. In 1901, he stumbles across a book, Aina Kamilat Islam. And he reads this book and he is immediately in awe of the writer. And he knows who this writer, the person that's written this book, this is the Messiah of the time. And he immediately writes his bath and sends it to the Prophet ﷺ. Approximately a year or two later, he decides to go to Hajj, approximately 1902, 1903 time. And on his way to Hajj, due to a plague that's been around at the time, the Ottoman Empire stops any travel into Mecca. So he decides then, therefore, instead of continuing or doing anything or going back to Kabul, he journeys to Qadian to meet the Prophet ﷺ. So you can see this journey here is approximately 500-600 miles via Lahore to Qadian. So he took heed of the hadith which says that if you have to cross over mountains and glaciers and crawl to see the Masih of the time, give him my salam. And he does just that. When he reaches Qadian, one of the first things he says is actually a verse from the Holy Quran, which translates to, "They will come from every distant track." This only goes to show his deep level of understanding of the Quran and his essence of Islamic nature in itself. And he was in awe of the Promised Messiah through his writings and obviously then from meeting him. He writes a Persian poem, and in that poem, one of the couplets that he writes translates to, "This king gives me a fragrance of light which illuminates my eyes. The light from his kingly face is exceedingly sweet." In essence, he was in love with the Promised Messiah ﷺ. He spends up to 3 months with him. And in that time, he gets to know him very well, learns from him. He goes for walks with him, massages his feet, spends a lot of time with the Prophet ﷺ. And there are some incidents I wish to narrate. One of which where, as you can imagine, in the early 1900s, 1902, 1903, the Qadian was a very dusty place. So if a person went out for a walk, they would come back and their clothes would be covered in dust. And when he'd return from a walk with the Prophet ﷺ, obviously his clothes are now covered in dust, he would stand in his room and wait 10-15 minutes. And companions of the Prophet ﷺ would ask him, "So why do you wait? Why don't you immediately dust your clothes off?" And he says that the Promised Messiah ﷺ has probably gone into his room and dusted his clothes, so I want to make sure that he's dusted his clothes before I begin dusting my clothes. And this goes to show the level of respect and love that he had from the Promised Messiah ﷺ. On a travel to Gillingham with the Promised Messiah, he began to have ilham, revelation, And in these revelations, he would hear the words, go to Pharaoh, present your head. And he knew what this meant. He knew that he had to go back to Kabul, and he knew the reaction of the king at the time and all the other Maulvis and heretics of the time. In fact, the companions of the Promised Messiah ﷺ actually tried stopping him, saying, look, you shouldn't go back, that's very dangerous for you. And he simply said, look, this is my destiny. I've been told I must go back. So he takes leave from the Promised Messiah ﷺ, and the Promised Messiah walks with him approximately 1.5 miles to the outskirts of Qadian. And now they get to a point where he's going to go on his way back to Kabul, and the Promised Messiah ﷺ is going to go back to where he is in Qadian. And immediately Sahibzada Abdul Latif falls to the floor and holds onto the Promised Messiah ﷺ's feet and begins profusely crying. And I think it's very important to note at this point, he's not crying because he's scared that I'm going to go back to Kabul and what's going to happen to me, what's going to be my plight, what's going to happen. He's just sad that I've encountered the Promised Messiah ﷺ, the person that was promised to the Akhareen, and now finally when I've met him and I've felt him in every way possible, I'm having to now leave him. And that saddened him great deal. He knew also that he's never going to see him again. So he remains down at his feet, crying, holding onto his feet. And the Promised Messiah ﷺ says to him, get up. And he remains there. And he says to him, Al-amru fawqa al-adab, which translates to that the obedience to me supersedes your respect for me. And immediately he stood up. And again, this shows the level of respect that he had for the Promised Messiah ﷺ. So he returns to Kabul, and the first thing that he does, he writes a few letters to the Maulvis of the time, telling them about his ba'ath and him becoming an Ahmadi. And he writes letters to them and tells them in person as well. And he knew what this would mean. He knew that the end result of this is not going to be good for him, but this was, as he put, his destiny. So before knowing about his arrest and what was to come, he looked at his hands, with one of his companions being nearby who narrates this. And he looks at his hands and says, do you possess the power to bear shackles? Asking himself. And then he turned to his companion and said, when I leave from here, that is when I am taken away, let the Promised Messiah ﷺ know of my death. And before he's taken away, he tells his wife and his family as well to remain steadfast, regardless of what happens, whatever anybody puts down on them or enforces on them from a religious perspective. Do not let go of your faith. Remain steadfast to your faith. That's your primary objective. And so it so happens that he's taken away to prison in a very, and again there was an interesting point at this point as well, which is that at that time there were some Afghan prisons that were entwined with the British government, which had slightly higher level of standard. I'm not saying that they were great, but they were slightly higher standard. The place where he was put in was the king's actual own prison, dungeon type place, which had very substandards. And not only was he put in this prison and this dungeon area, but he was put in chains that were wrapped around his neck and his chest, his waist, and down at his ankles as well. And these weighed up to 50 kilograms. And, if you can imagine, 4 months he remained in this plight with this weight. And I think if anybody here that goes to the gym or picks up a bit of weight, they'll realize that 50 kilograms, it's a lot for a couple of seconds. This is 4 months. And he was a 50-year-old man at this point as well. It could not have been easy. The king and his brother, so King Habibullah and his brother Nasrullah Khan, they try in all vain to say to him, renounce your faith. Take back your claim that the Messiah has come and all these things that you believe in, this is heresy. Take away your claim. And Sahibzada Abdul Latif says, how can I do that? I see him like a man sees the aftab, like a person sees the sun. That's how vivid he is. So how can I take away my claim? So July 14th, 1903, Sahibzada Abdul Latif, he's set a punishment. Now, in today's time, that punishment would be in lines of all your wealth taken away, fines, maybe a situation where a person's put in prison for 25, 30 years. But what they did was they put a string around his neck and a plaque on his chest, which explained all the reasoning for his punishment. And then at the end of it, it was said liable for death. So they, from their perspective, put it quite straight that this person is now going to be executed. And he's then, there's also beyond that, there's a hole drilled through his nose and a rope put through the hole. And then he's, from that point, dragged to the place of his execution. And as he's being dragged and pulled towards his execution, he walks briskly as much as he can while he's being pulled. And he has some eagerness in the way that he's being pulled. And people asked him, saying, look, you're getting dragged to your execution. Do you understand where you're going? Like, are you not fearful? And he says that these chains that are around me are like my ornaments before I meet my Lord. I consider them like my jewelry. And beyond this, he would pray for all of these people, saying, "Oh Allah, bring them to the right path." So he's taken to the execution ground and he's buried right up to his torso. And the king, so you can imagine at this point also, just to portray what's happening, he's got no sense of his hands. He's just buried up to his torso. So the only movement that he has is of his head. And the king orders the first stone to be thrown at him. And as it's hurtled towards him, it's hit on his head, and it causes a gash which loads of blood kind of pours out of that. And obviously his head goes down. And as his head goes down, King Habibullah stops everybody and says, stop throwing stones. He's repented. So the king feels that that's it. He's now taken back his belief. That's it. And immediately, Sahibzada Abdul Latif, he raises his head and shouts that this man, he's a liar, and I am firm on my belief. And then Sahibzada Abdul Latif says, कि ऐ पत्थरों गवाह रहना कि मैंने हज़रत अहमद कादियान को महदी माना है. O stones, remain witness that I have accepted Hazrat Ahmad Qadiani as the Mahdi. और ए रेत के ज़र्रो तुम भी गवाह रहना कि मैं हज़रत अहमद कादियान पे ईमान रखता हूँ. And O grains of sand, you too remain my witness that I have firm belief in Hazrat Ahmad Qadiani. और ए ज़मीन और ए आसमां और ए हवाओं तुम भी गवाह रहना कि मैंने एक मिनट के लिए भी हज़रत अहमद कादियानी का इनकार नहीं किया है. And O earth and heavens and the winds, you too remain witness that even for 1 minute I never denounced my faith in Hazrat Ahmad Qadiani. So the stones came hurtling towards him, and it said that at the end of this brutality, the stones had completely covered him. You could actually not see him. So as you can imagine, the Prophet ﷺ knew of the situation that was to come for Sahibzada Abdul Latif. And the Prophet ﷺ says about Kabul and Afghanistan कि ऐ काबुल की ज़मीन तू गवाह है कि तेरे पे सख्त जुर्म का इर्तिकाब किया गया है. ऐ बदकिस्मत ज़मीन तू खुदा की नज़र से गिर गई कि तू इस जुल्म अज़ीम की जगह है. O land of Kabul, you are witness to the heinous crime committed on your soil. O miserable land, you have, in the sight of Allah, been condemned, as you are the scene of this most atrocious crime. So what happens? What's the aftermath of this brutality, of this shahadat, of this martyrdom? That same night, 9 p.m., a huge storm hits Kabul, one that's not been seen before, the type that it was, and there was a lot of damage caused. There was a huge outbreak of cholera. This is actually reported as well, actually on the same day, July 14th, 1903. Huge outbreak of cholera. If you look into the reports, up to 400 or 500 people were dying on a daily basis. And then beyond that, I think it's very simple to see. Kabul at that time was a place of monarchy with a decent infrastructure. And as time goes on over the 100 years, I think there's no point in me explaining the fact that geopolitical tensions, socio-economic downfall, the monarchy completely gets disassembled. And a person has to ask that, is this the doing of man, or is this the will of God? And then King Habibullah, and his brother Nasrullah, what happened to them? So King Habibullah was actually assassinated, and his brother Nasrullah, he lost his wife and child to cholera, the outbreak that came, and he also, some say, went mad. And interestingly enough, when you look into it, he actually ended up in the same prison as Sahibzada Abdul Latif. Khalifa Rabi Rahmanullah narrates a very interesting incident in which a prominent member of the Jamaat met a friend of his who was a renowned architect. This architect had been given the responsibility to build a minaret to represent the freedom of Afghanistan. So you have to understand that this is now decades on from Shahadat. This is a separate story, which will come back to the Shahadat, but this is a situation where a person knew an architect from Afghanistan, and this architect built this minar. And when this Ahmadi friend of his saw this minar, he said to him, well, first of all, he was very perplexed, and he said, what on earth possessed you to build this minar at this place? Because it was set in a very rural area with streets all around it. You'd expect a minaret that is supposed to show a sign of freedom, for which it was, to be at a very high ground and have some prominence to it and some majesty to it. And the architect, who was actually a very old man at this point, said that I was told to build a minaret in representation of a symbol of freedom for Afghanistan. And also the location of this minaret should be in a location of freedom as well. And he said, I found no better place than this place that I show you today. And he says, because when I was a child, I saw something in this very street that has stayed deeply imprinted within me. I saw an elderly man bound in chains being taken for his execution. We as children went running to see this spectacle. But what do I see? I see no fear on this man's face. I see just majesty on his face. Such freedom, such fearlessness, and such contentment, and such a smile of assurance which never ever leaves my mind. So when I was asked by my people to tribute the Afghan spirit of freedom, I thought no better place than this place. And this is Minar Najat. This has actually been built twice. It got knocked down and then it was built again. So again, not a high lofty place, but the irony that the country that wants to show a sign of freedom took away the very rights of Sahibzada Abdul Latif many years ago. In respect to this high-level saint, this wondrous man of God, the Hazrat Nasir Mosque says, कि ऐ अब्दुल लतीफ़ तेरे पे हज़ारों रहमतें कि तूने मेरी ज़िंदगी में सिद्क़ का नमूना दिखाया कि O Abdul Latif, may thousands and thousands of blessings be upon you as you have demonstrated your truthful example in my life. I would like to end by reciting a couplet with permission from a poem written by Khalifa Rabi Rahmatullah alayh. Hazur फरमाते हैं, खून शहीदान उम्मत का ऐ कम नज़र, खून शहीदान उम्मत का ऐ कम नज़र, रातेगा कब गया था कि अब जाएगा, हर शहादत तेरे देखते देखते, हर शहादत तेरे देखते देखते, फूल फल आएगी, फूल फल जाएगी, फूल फल आएगी, फूल फल जाएगी.
Jazakumullah for that, very inspiring. Enjoyed that. बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम. जैसा कि आप दोस्तों ने सुन ही लिया है
رفیق بھٹی صاحب نے آج جو پیش کیا ہے وہ حضرت صاحبزادہ عبد اللطیف شہید رضی اللہ عنہ کے بارے تھا. ہم سب ہی جانتے ہیں کہ یہ ایک دردناک واقعہ تھا جو کابل کی سرزمین پہ گزرا، اور جس طرح انہوں نے یہ بیان کیا ہے، ہم نے کتابوں میں تو اکثر یہ پڑھا ہی ہوا ہے قصہ، اور حضرت مسیح موعود علیہ السلام کی کتاب تذکرۃ الشہادتین بھی اسی موضوع پہ ہے، لیکن جس طرح انہوں نے آج بیان کیا ہے یہ بڑا ریئلسٹک سا ہمیں وہ تصور مل جاتا ہے کہ صاحبزادہ صاحب رضی اللہ عنہ جو تھے وہ ایک کابل میں شخصیت تھے، بہت مانے جانے شخصیت تھے، جو وہاں کے جو شہزادہ تھا ان کے بہت قریب تھے، اور آپ بھی ان کی کچھ 50,000 جو تھے ان کے ماننے والے تھے. تو وہ ان کو بہت شوق تھا کہ اسلام کی تعلیم کے بارے میں بڑا سفر کیا، اور جس طرح انہوں نے بتایا کہ وہ امرتسر میں بھی انہوں نے 3 سال گزارے اسی غرض میں. تو وہاں پہ ان کو حضرت مسیح موعود علیہ السلام کے بارے میں علم ہوا، انہوں نے جو کتاب پڑھی اس کے بعد ان کو یقین ہو گیا کہ یہی وہ مسیح ہے جس کا مسلمان انتظار کر رہے ہیں، اور انہوں نے کوئی وقت نہیں ضائع کیا، لیکن ایک دم ہی انہوں نے بیعت کر لی حضور کی. تو واپس چلے گئے کابل، اور ان کی کوشش یہ تھی کہ وہ حج پہ جائیں اس کے بعد، لیکن کیونکہ ان دنوں میں طاعون تھا پنجاب میں، یہ بھی طاعون جو ہے ہمیں پتہ ہی ہے کہ یہ بھی ایک بہت بڑا نشان تھا صداقت حضرت مسیح موعود کے بارے میں. تو جو حکومت تھی، اوٹومن حکومت تھی، وہ اجازت نہیں دیتی تھی کہ پنجاب میں سے کوئی حج کے لیے آئے، اس لیے وہ حج پہ نہ جا سکے، لیکن انہوں نے یہ سفر پھر قادیان کا سفر اختیار کیا، اور وہ بھی پیشن گوئی حضرت رسول کریم صلی اللہ علیہ وسلم کی پوری ہوئی کہ برفوں کے پہاڑوں سے گزر کے وہ تیری بیعت کرنے کے لیے آئیں گے. کابل آپ کو پتہ ہی ہے کہ ایک بڑا ماؤنٹنس ریجن ہے، اور وہاں پہ یہ گلیشیئرز ہیں، اور یہ بڑا مشکل سفر تھا جو انہوں نے کیا لاہور تک، اور لاہور سے پھر قادیان. وہ حضور کے ساتھ کچھ عرصہ انہوں نے وہاں پہ گزارا، اور حضور کے ساتھ بہت سا موقع ملا حضور سے سوالات کرنے کا، حضور کی سننے کے، حضور کے ساتھ سفر پہ شام کو سفر جو حضور کرتے تھے، سیر کرتے تھے، ان کے حضور کے ساتھ بھی وہ حضور کے ساتھ بھی شامل ہوئے. اس میں ایک جو بات انہوں نے بڑی اچھی ہمیں بتائی ہے کہ وہ جب یہ شام کی سیر سے واپس آتے تھے تو ان کے کپڑوں پہ مٹی لگی ہوتی تھی، اپنے کمرے میں واپس چلے جاتے تھے، لیکن ایک دم وہ مٹی جو صاف نہیں کرتے تھے. تو جو ان کے ساتھ ان کے ہوتے تھے ساتھی، وہ کہتے تھے کیا بات ہے آپ اندر آ گئے ہیں، اب تو مٹی صاف کر لیں. تو ان کا یہ کہنا ہوتا تھا کہ نہیں، حضور بھی واپس گئے ہوں گے اپنے کمرے میں، اور وہ بھی یہ مٹی جھاڑ رہے ہوں گے، لیکن میں یہ چاہتا ہوں کہ پہلے حضور جھاڑ لیں تو اس کے بعد میں کروں. یہ تھا ان کا مقام کہ حضور کو وہ جس طرح انہوں نے پہچانا شاید کسی اور نے نہیں پہچانا ہوگا. ان کو یہ تو پتہ تھا کہ جب وہ کابل افغانستان واپس جائیں گے تو ان کے ساتھ کیا ہوگا. تو لیکن کچھ لوگوں نے ان کو کوشش بھی کی کہ وہ واپس نہ جائیں، لیکن صاحبزادہ صاحب نے کہا تھا کہ نہیں، یہ جو ہے یہی میری مقدر میں ہے، اس کے بارے میں مجھے خدا تعالیٰ سے بھی خبر مل چکی ہے، تو واپس جانا ہی میرے لیے ہے. تو جب وہ واپس کابل چلے گئے تو انہوں نے وہاں پہ بتا دیا، جو ملائیں تھے ان کو خط کے ذریعے بتا دیا کہ میں نے مسیح اور مہدی کو مان لیا ہے. تو اس کے بارے میں پھر جو تفتیش ہوئی تو ان کو یہ سزا سنائی گئی، سزائے موت تھی. اور جو واقعہ ہے ہمیں پتہ ہی ہے کہ ان کو سنگسار کیا گیا ایک میدان میں لے کر جا کر، اور پتھراؤ ہوا ان کے اوپر. جو پہلا پتھر ان کو جس طرح رفیق صاحب نے بتایا کہ سر پہ لگا، تو ان کا سر جو ہے وہ نیچے کی طرف ہو چکا. تو جو وہاں پہ شہزادہ تھا اس نے کہا کہ روکیں ابھی اور پتھراؤ نہ کریں، کیونکہ انہوں نے توبہ کر لی ہے. تو تب صاحبزادہ صاحب رضی اللہ عنہ نے اپنا سر اٹھا کر کہا کہ میں نے بالکل توبہ نہیں کی, میں نے مرزا غلام احمد قادیانی کو مسیح اور مہدی مان لی ہے, اور یہ سب جو یہاں پہ اس وقت موجود ہیں وہ یہ بات سن رہے ہیں. اس کے بعد پھر جس طرح پتھروں کا ہوا ان کے اوپر, تو وہ جو ہے اتنے پتھر جمع ہو گئے کہ وہاں ان کو دیکھا نہیں جا سکتا تھا. تو یہ ہوا تھا واقعہ ان کے ساتھ. تو یہ کچھ چیزیں ہیں جو ہم نے آج بھی سیکھی ہیں, پہلے بھی کچھ یاد تھیں, لیکن جس طرح انہوں نے آج بتائی ہیں بہت ہی ایموشنل ہیں, لیکن ہمیں یہ سبق دیتی ہیں کہ قربانی جو ہے وہ ہماری ایک زندگی کا حصہ ہی ہوتی ہے. مختلف قسموں کی قربانیاں ہوتی ہیں. یہ جو رمضان سے گزر رہے ہیں اس میں بھی تو ہم قربانی کرتے ہیں, لیکن جو وہ قربانی تھی وہ سب سے اہم قربانی تھی. تو اللہ تعالیٰ ان کی شہادت قبول کرے, اور جو بعد میں بھی جماعت احمدیہ میں آپ کو پتہ ہی ہے مسلسل شہادتیں ہوتی رہتی ہیں. اللہ تعالیٰ احمدیوں کو اپنی حفظ و امان میں رکھے تاکہ یہ جو سلسلہ ہے یہ ختم ہو اور دنیا جو ہے مسیح اور مہدی کو مانے.